Hey, what is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today is a very exciting day. We finally got back all the engine stuff for our LS for the FJ40 build. So we got block, crank, rods, pistons, bearings, rings, everything. I just had the machine shop order everything for me just because they can get a way better price. But either way, let's check this stuff out. This stuff turned out really good. So far, I haven't measured anything, but I'm hoping everything is gonna be a-okay. There is a couple different methods on measuring everything, and I'm gonna show you the kind of the better way and the not so good way, or we'll call it the faster way to measure clearances. And then we just gotta get everything ready for this thing. So let's check it out real quick. I'll show you what we are working with and we'll get right to measuring. So here's the block, which really surprised me is they actually painted it and they put all new plugs here. You can see brand new dowels up top on the deck surface for the heads. Everything looks super good. I've never had a machine shop paint the block. I never even asked him, and I don't even think he charged me for it. So I am stoked about that. Everything looks really good there. Crank is the standard, so he just did just a little polish on it. It was in really good shape, so that didn't need much work. He did recon the rods and hooked me up with a set of, I believe, Gen 4 flat top pistons, and these actually have a bigger pin, and it's a full floating pin, you can see there. So all that is good to go, and he hung those for me. So I'm stoked about that. We got all the bearings and rings here, so we're gonna bust these out. These are from Engine Tech. I know they're not probably as good as King's, but this is a stock-ish rebuild, so we're not going for super high end. These are going to be just fine. And then here's the rings. We got to check out the ring end gaps. So first things first, I want to check all the bearing clearances. So let's get these bearings out. We got to throw the mains in the block here, so we got to pull the caps off. We'll get the main bearings in, and then basically here's the two different methods on measuring those bearing clearances. So we can use all these tools. These are going to be a lot more accurate, a lot more expensive, but a lot more accurate. The cheap, fast way, a lot of you are probably going to hate on this, but I'm just kind of actually curious how accurate this stuff is. But this is plastic gauge, so it is basically, I'll show you when we get, let me pull one out. So you can see I pulled it out there. It's just a really thin little piece of plastic basically that you stick on the bearing surface, and then you put the crank in, torque the caps down, and it squishes that little plastic rod. If it'll focus on it, it squishes that, and then you use this as your range. So this one, that's millimeter, flip it over to inch. This goes from 1 to 3 thousandths. These bearings should be around 2 thousandths. So you can see that green line right there. It should be the width of the squish out on that rod should be right at the same width on the packaging here. So that's the fast way. We'll do that first, and then we'll come back through with all the tools and we'll measure it again and kind of see how close it is. There's one time in your life where you want to be as clean as you can possibly be. It is right now building an engine. So when I get the blocks back from the machine shop, I like to go through and blow out all the holes, make sure there's no dirt, no grime, no nothing anywhere, make sure it is clean. I'll take some brake cleaner and clean off the surfaces where all the bearings sit on the block and on the main caps. And then we'll go through, get all the bearings installed. Make sure you install these bearings correctly. There are oil holes in the bearings that sit in the block. The ones on the caps don't have any holes. And then we'll go through the crank, do the same thing with brake cleaner, clean it all up, blow it all off. There was actually some like towel lint on this one, and that can actually screw up your measurements if it falls onto a bearing. And then you clamp your bearing cap down on the crank it can actually mess up your clearances. So you want to make sure it is as clean as possible. So now that we're all clean, we're going to use the plastic gauge method to check the clearances. So what we got to do is we're going to set the crank in the block, and then we're going to take little strips of the plastic gauge and set it on top of the main journal, and then we'll put the caps and clamp the caps down, torque those down, and then we'll pull the caps back off, and then we'll use the packaging on the plastic gauge to gauge how much that actually squished out, and that'll give us our oil clearance. All right, you can see what we did there. So we laid the plastic gauge on top. It looks like a lot of it stayed on the caps, but you can see the squish out right there, right there, right there. It's probably gonna look better on here. So yeah, that looks a lot better right there. So what we're gonna basically do is get those bolts out of the way. We're gonna take our packaging, like I said, here, and we're just going to use that to kind of measure that clearance. It's easier on the crank, but you can see right there that actually lines up perfect with 2 thousandths. So it looks like that is about 2 thou, which is right where it should be. You can come down here, and if you can see that, here's a better one right here. Let's see if we can get in here a little better. Right there. So you can see that lines up about perfect with 2 thousandths. So we know we're in the ballpark. Obviously, this isn't super accurate. So what we're going to do now is scrape all this off. You can just scrape it off with your fingernail, make sure that's all cleaned up. And then we're going to bolt these back onto the block without the crank. We'll pull the crank out and torque these back down. And then we'll take our snap handle T gauges right here, and we'll use those to get the distance in the hole here. And then we'll compare that to the measurement of the crank, and we're going to use these outside micrometers for that. So I'll go into depth once we get that far. So let's get the crank out, get all this stuff scraped off, get these caps bolted back on, and see how close this plastic gauge is. All right, the final numbers are in, and we are looking at 2 3/10, 2 4/10, 2 5/10, and 2 5/10 for the last three. So that is right about good. That's right where we want it, kind of around 2 to 2 5, 2 6/10, maybe even 2 8/10 for clearance wise. Now, how we do this is, I'll kind of go over this real quick. It's kind of try to explain it to you without actually showing you in hand, it's kind of hard to be able to use these because it's largely dependent on how it feels. So what you want to do is hold it with one hand kind of loosely, and you get it over the journal, and then you'll slowly tighten down the dial until you just barely feel it touching, and you kind of want to move it around, make sure it's not, you know, crooked on there, make sure it's straight. Kind of want to go up and down, side to side, make sure it feels like it's straight and flat and it's just got a little bit of drag on it, and then you'll pull that measurement. As far as these T-handles go, these are a little bit more tricky to use. This end dial here is what locks the end in, so you'll collapse it, you'll get it in the bore like so, and then you want to kind of scoot it forward and back a little bit, get it centered in the bore, and then you want to tip it forward just a little bit and tighten this handle down to lock it, and then you'll basically just roll it out like that, and that'll give you your measurement. It's really picky. You got to really get it dialed in on how it feels, because you can be off, you know, a few thousandths just measuring it even when it feels the same. So let's go back, measure it, do it like 4 times on each journal, make sure you get the same reading. So we are good to go there. As far as plastic gauge goes, I would say it's fairly accurate. I mean, it's only accurate enough to where, you know, you can see 1, 2, 3 thou. So I mean, you can get the general idea of how accurate it is, but definitely buying the tools, doing it this way, it just takes out any guesswork at all. You just get the exact measurements, know exactly what we're working with. So now that we're good with that, I'm not even going to bother with plastic gauge on the rods. We're going to take these apart, get the caps off, get the bearings in the caps, get these caps torqued back on the rods, and then we'll do the same procedure with measuring the rods and measuring the crank. We'll write everything down so we have it all in writing, and this measurement should be, this clearance should be about the same as the mains. Hey, a little fun fact for you guys. If you ever looked at a rod and the mating surface between the cap and the rod is super uneven and rough and it just looks broken, that is because it is. These are actually cracked rods is what they call them. And they actually break these rods. Instead of having a machine surface, when it's broken and super rough like that, the cap mates back to the rod just like it was before. And it kind of locks into place with all those weird edges and grooves and everything how it broke. So a little fun fact for you guys. When I first heard that, I didn't think it was real until I actually researched it. Look at those numbers, guys. Those rods are so perfect. I didn't do the math, but that's right at about 2 thou clearance, which is perfect on all the rods. So we are good to go there. One thing I think I'm going to do before I start measuring bore is I think I'm just going to measure the cam bearings real quick just to see the clearance on those, make sure those are good. The machine shop did install all new cam bearings, so I know a lot of people don't measure it, but might as well. We already got the tools, we got the cam, we got the bearings. Let's measure it real quick, see those clearances, and then I'm going to show you guys a couple different ways to measure piston to cylinder clearance. One way is kind of just like the way we did here. It's just kind of a general idea. You don't get a really accurate measurement, but close enough for the average Joe, I suppose. It might work. So I'll show you that in a sec though. Let's get these cam bearings measured out. All right, we had to check the cam bearings a little bit different just because when you're using these snap gauges, this is actually a 2 1/8 to 3 1/2, and this one goes to 2 1/8. But when you're at the very bottom or the very top of the range, I've tried it many times and I can't get a consistent number. So I opted to just grab this bore gauge and use that. So what you basically do when you're using this bore gauge, we're going to do the same thing when we measure the cylinder bore. You basically take the diameter of the cam. So that's the journal right here. That is that diameter, and then we're going to zero the gauge between there so that the gauge is set up to show 0 clearance. And then once we throw it in the bearing surface or the cylinder bore or whatever, you get the clearance. And we were right about 3 thousandths, which is perfect for the cam bearing. So we are good to go there. I'm going to leave the cam and we are going to start on piston to cylinder wall. So same exact thing. We're going to take our outside micrometer, measure these pistons. And these ones are a little bit different because they have this Teflon coating, which is about 1 thousandths thick. You can see that window right there. That is where you're supposed to actually measure the piston diameter. So we're going to set the piston down. We're going to measure with the outside micrometers in that little window. And then we'll take that and zero, like same way we did the cam. We're going to zero out the gauge on the micrometer, and then we'll stick it in the bore. You want to measure 3 different angles on the bore and then 3 different heights on the bore, just to make sure the bore is straight and not tapered, all egg shaped and all tapered. So that is the game plan. One other way you can do this, and it's not as good, especially when you have a Teflon coating, is you can use a feeler gauge. Now there's been a few machine shops that have done that. That's how they actually measure when they're doing their finish hone and everything. They measure with a feeler gauge. I don't have any super long ones. They use like a 6-inch long, but the problem is you're going to be measuring on top of that coating. So you basically have to, I think this coating is about 0.8 of a thou, so pretty much 1 thousandth. So you'd have to take 1 thousandth out of the actual measurement. But these pistons are a pretty tight fit. So with that coating, this is 1 thou, and then so basically you want 2 thousandths total without the coating. So with the coating, you're at about 1 thousandths clearance, which is pretty tight, especially on a bore this big. But I'll show you guys. I'll try to use a feeler gauge. If you use a feeler gauge and you're measuring up here, it's going to be way off because the top of the piston is way smaller than the bottom. The biggest part of the piston is about 1/2 inch up on this skirt, right where, well, I'll just right there where that window is. That's the largest part of the piston. So that's what you want to measure. So that's the game plan. Let's measure this out. I'll show you guys with a feeler gauge. Maybe I'll take a 1 thou feeler gauge, shove it in there, and see how accurate that feels. And like measuring all these bearings, it's all based on feel. I mean, you probably could cram a 2 or 3 thou feeler gauge in there and rip it out. You'll probably scratch the whole piston, but it'll still fit. But that's not, I mean, it's going to be way too tight. So it's really based on feel. When you're doing all this stuff, you want to feel resistance, but you don't want it super tight where you got to pull it off. It should slide nice and smooth, but there shouldn't be any play and any movement in the, in the micrometer. All right, we got this bore gauge set up. So like I said, you want to do basically 1, 2, 3 ways that way, and then height wise. So we'll come in here, stick that in at an angle, and then you'll just rotate that up until you get the highest measurement. And we are right at about 2 thousandths. That is perfect. So I'll spin it, do that again, just a touch under 2, spin it again, a touch over 2. I don't expect these to be absolutely perfect, just because when they do finish hone these, they do get hot and distort a little bit. But that is actually really close. Right about 2 to 2.5. I am happy with that, as long as they're all right about 2, 2.5. That was a little bit tight. Right up at the top, a little over 2. Not bad though. So I'm gonna go through, check all 8 cylinders. There's 2 2/10, 2 5/10. So I'm gonna go through, check all of them. I assume they'll all be good. And then all these pistons actually measured out perfect. So they have a measurement on the box right there, 3.781. I was getting 3.7805, so 5/10 difference, but that's just difference in tooling. I'm sure these outside micrometers are kind of a cheaper brand, so they're not probably super accurate, but close enough, definitely close enough for doing this kind of work. So I'm gonna go through, check all the bores, make sure all that is good, and we should be set. All right, now that we know we got about 2.5 thou clearance on cylinder to piston, we're gonna try this feeler gauge. So the smallest one I have is 1.5 thou right there. So what we're gonna do is put the piston in upside down. We're gonna put this alongside the skirt right there. And we got 2.5 thou clearance, and we have a 1.5 thou. So that'll take up the extra 1/1000th of clearance of that Teflon coating there. So let's try that, then I'll see how it feels. You should, like I said, you should be able to feel just a little bit of resistance, but you shouldn't have to pull it out super hard. It should slide out, but I mean, you should still feel some resistance on it. So that was pretty tight. I wasn't able to pull the feeler gauge out. So if I had a thou feeler gauge, that would probably work. I know these bores were a little bit tighter up top, so I bet if I had a 1 thou feeler gauge, that would work. But either way, honestly, the best way to do this is just with a micrometer, just because, especially with these pistons with the coating on it, it's super, I mean, you can't really get an accurate measurement unless you subtract the coating out of the diameter there and then use your feeler gauge for that. So honestly, this stuff will work. I mean, if you're just doing one engine, maybe grab some feeler gauges, grab some plastic gauge, and you could probably get in the right ballpark anyway, just to make sure the clearances are somewhat close. But the best way to do it is to use some tools. So now that we are good with that, let's grab rings, and we got to check all the ring end gaps. This is super easy. You just basically slide the ring in the bore, square it up with the piston, just push it down with the piston, and then we'll use our feeler gauges to measure the gap in between the ends of the rings. Just you want enough gap to where when they expand, they don't butt up against each other. That can cause some major issues. So I'll get all these pulled out, set up, and ready to throw in the bore and measure. One thing I like to do when setting these ring end gaps, even if you don't have to grind them, I like to number out which ring I stuck in which bore, and I throw that on the piston that goes into that bore. So I keep the pistons in the right spot and then the rings all in the right spot where I measured them. So all the pistons measured identical, so that doesn't really matter. Rings, it really matters once you start actually opening up gaps and everything. You want to set each ring to each cylinder, but even if you don't mess with them, I still like to put the ring in the cylinder that I measured it in, just to make sure I know that we have the correct gap. All right, we got all these rings installed. They went on super easy. So I want to show you guys kind of how to set these ring gaps on the piston. So oil ring, the actual expander gap is in line with the center line of the pin right there. And then you want to offset the gap on the bottom ring right there, gap on the top ring right there. And then I just put one gap on each side of the skirt. So top or second ring is on this side, flip it around, top ring gap is right there. So you just don't want any of the gaps to line up, because you'll get a lot of compression leak and blow by through that. So that's why we especially want to offset the top ring and second ring 180 degrees from each other. Well, that's it, guys. Everything seems to measure out really good, like it should. I'm stoked. We got everything measured out. Everything is good to go. Now I hope this helps you guys out if you're building an engine. This is pretty much the same process on any engine, really. They're pretty much all the same. How you go about measuring all your bearing clearances, piston to cylinder clearance, all that kind of stuff. Pretty much the same across the board for basically any engine out there with this style of bearing. Now, as far as the plastic gauge goes, if you're doing this, you know, if you're building a one engine maybe, then you could probably get away with it. But if you're gonna do, so I don't know, if I'd say if you're gonna do more than one engine, it pays to just get some tools and do it right. That way you can get exactly what these things measure at, the clearances, because it is very important. Now, the plastic gauge get you close, could probably get you close enough to run it, but like I said, it's better to know exactly what you got. Now, if you guys need help selecting tools, I'll have all this stuff that I used linked down in the description box. These are cheaper tools. You can spend a ton of money on like the outside micrometers. Like I said, these ones are a cheaper one, but honestly, I haven't had any issues with them. They seem to measure pretty accurate. Well, that's a wrap, guys. Really hope you enjoyed it. Why don't you go smash that thumbs up button, comment, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.